Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Pitfall, a platforming title developed by David Crane and published by Activision, released on the Atari 2600 console back in 1982, with ports to various other contemporary platforms, including the Intellivision, Commodore 64, Atari 5200, and ColecoVision. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 128. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean, Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broad population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Pitfall. Pitfall is a platforming title developed by David Crane and published by Activision for the Atari 2600 console back in 1982, with various ports to other systems from around that time following. Before we can talk about Pitfall, we need to take a step back and discuss the game's creator, David Crane, an incredibly influential game designer and programmer in the early years of the video game industry, having been responsible for a number of beloved classic titles, the founding of a company that still exists today, and eventual recognition as one of the top 100 game designers of all time. As with many of the individuals we discuss on this podcast, though, Crane didn't simply spring into existence and make a name for himself as a legendary game designer. No, in actuality, Crane sprung into existence in 1954 as the newborn son of a couple living in the relatively small town of Napanee, Indiana. Back when Crane was born, the concept of quote-unquote video games wasn't yet a thing, as the majority of recreational games that you might find in arcades of the time were limited to electromechanical devices with physical rather than digital components, like pinball machines. Interestingly though, that wouldn't be an issue for Crane, as even from a very early age, he was incredibly interested in these and other physical devices, not so much from the perspective of playing these games, but more from the perspective of trying to figure out how the heck they actually worked. In fact, as a young child, Crane became absolutely enthralled with engineering and technology, and there are a bunch of different stories that talk about Crane's technical aptitude, even in his pre-teenage years. Just to give a few examples, when Crane was still a child, he ended up dismantling one of his family's televisions in order to make a pseudo-remote control attached to his bedside table. A move that I'd suggest was driven by laziness, if not for the fact that the act of dismantling a cathode ray tube-based television set is incredibly dangerous, requires an insane amount of technical know-how and skill, and is something that I, as a 43-year-old man, wouldn't really want to do, let alone attempting to dismantle a television as a prepubescent boy. Those television shenanigans were potentially the least dangerous experiments Crane performed as a child, though, as he also built, from scratch, an entire television in a cabinet on his wall, which I've got to believe was a fire and electrical hazard, and also created a laser device that was powerful enough to ignite a match from across a room, which was definitely a fire hazard. Luckily for Crane and his family, despite the inherent danger prevalent in these early childhood adventures in engineering, none of Crane's experiments ended with anything other than a fully functional prototype, as well as a bit of additional knowledge that Crane hoped to be able to continue to apply to future engineering projects. While Crane would continue to tinker with various physical devices and electronics over the years, he would also eventually be exposed to the concept of digital video game entertainment when his parents bought him the very first home video game console to ever be created, the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey was released in 1972 and was designed with a unique concept in mind. As was the case with all video games of the time, including those that were slowly making their way into arcades around the world, digital video games were incapable of displaying any degree of graphics or colors. Any games that existed were solely comprised of geometric shapes, most often squares and rectangles, simply because they were easy to draw, and the Magnavox Odyssey was no different. Its hardware was designed to display some rudimentary shapes on the screen, with player imagination required to make those shapes become something more meaningful than their basic geometry would dictate. The Odyssey, however, went one step further. While it was limited by the technology of the time, each game would also utilize a number of translucent overlays that players could place on their television screens, which would effectively allow for each game to have a background of sorts, and each game was programmed with the assumption that those overlays were being used, assigning various sections of the screen to specific actions. This, unlike other types of games from around the time, like the popular back-and-forth action of Atari's Pong, provided game developers with a way to introduce unique mechanics that could allow players to experience deeper, more engaging gameplay than the comparatively simpler arcade games of the era. And you might think that Crane, upon seeing that fairly advanced Magnavox Odyssey, would be impressed with what the machine could do. Only here, you'd be entirely wrong. Crane took one look at the Odyssey and its, in his words, rudimentary games, and basically said thanks, but no thanks. He was intrigued by the potential of the home console, but the games that were actually available for the device, he thought they were way too simple to truly provide a meaningful gameplay experience. This early exposure to video games did, however, kindle an interest in more digital forms of technology, and when Crane was shown his first actual computer, also in the early 70s, he realized that this was something he could potentially learn to love. Unlike the Magnavox Odyssey, which was designed for people to experience games that other individuals developed, the computer was a device that allowed talented developers the ability to actually create their own experiences, with the only limitations of those experiences driven by an individual's imagination and the technical capabilities of whatever machine they were working on. Crane became enamored with computer technology, so much so that he decided to take several programming classes while he was still in high school, simply as a way to begin broadening his horizons. Well, to say his horizons were broadened would be an understatement, as by the time he graduated high school, he understood how to develop software at an expert level in 3 different computer programming languages. This, for those who might be wondering, was not a normal level of expertise for a high school student in the early 70s. Crane was, unquestionably, a very bright young man. He was so intelligent, in fact, that when he decided to go to college, he ended up completing 4 years' worth of study in around 33 months, graduating in 1975 with a degree in electrical engineering, a natural evolution of the technology and engineering experiments he had previously explored as a young child. And it turns out that he would take that inherent engineering expertise, coupled with his newly acquired formal college education, and apply both of those collectively in his first postgraduate work experience, when he ended up being hired as a hardware designer for National Semiconductor, a company that would eventually be purchased by Texas Instruments, but who were, at the time, focused on creating integrated circuits for a wide variety of uses, from traditional computer circuitry to more specialized applications used in display devices and audio amplifiers. Crane began working for the company shortly after his graduation, but it wouldn't take long before he realized that he wanted to do something different with his life, which is what prompted him to begin looking for alternate employment opportunities. A couple years after Crane began working at National Semiconductor, a perfect opportunity would present itself, as the rapidly expanding video game company Atari was looking for game designers and programmers who could make games for their newly released Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, otherwise known as the Atari 2600. While Crane didn't have a ton of professional programming experience, he did have a lot of exposure to hobbyist programming, electronics, and hardware engineering, which he thought might be able to translate into a job at Atari. Most importantly, he believed that due to his background, he could understand the underlying hardware of any electronic device better than many pure software developers could ever hope to understand it, which he thought would make him a perfect candidate to join the Atari team, as he had a degree of engineering know-how more advanced than nearly anyone else at the company. Well, it turns out Atari agreed with Crane's assertions, and he would in fact join the company as a game designer in 1978. After joining Atari, Crane would begin working on several different games and arcade conversions, and would also be tasked with working on the operating system for the Atari 800, an 8-bit home computer that Atari was in the process of engineering for an eventual 1979 release. In all instances, Crane's work would result in high-quality games, and while none of the titles he worked on are what I'd consider true industry heavyweight kinds of releases, they were all incredibly successful and popular in their own right. In fact, Crane, along with a handful of other talented developers, would become responsible for the vast majority of Atari's cartridge sales, and the company was incredibly proud to inform them of that fact. Atari, in a move that feels like a clear example of not reading the room, decided to send this small contingent of 10-ish developers an internal memo, thanking them for all of their efforts and recognizing that their collective efforts were responsible for $60 million out of the total $100 million of cartridge sales the company had enjoyed up to that point. Good job, team! Now, you might be wondering what kind of bonus, royalty, or other compensation packages were offered to these seemingly high-value developers in an attempt to retain their talents for the company. Well, the answer to that question was not much. In fact, Crane and others were becoming increasingly frustrated by the lack of compensation packages available to developers, as other than their base $30,000 salaries, developers would receive no form of formal bonus or royalty payments, regardless of how well their games might have sold. And even beyond the monetary aspect of this mind-boggling business decision, game designers and developers were often not recognized or credited publicly for their contributions. In fact, many companies, Atari included, took steps to intentionally obscure the fact that individual people worked on their titles. The thought at Atari in particular was, if a game was created at the company, it was a product of the company, and the individuals who worked on that game didn't deserve any discrete recognition. The fact that they had the privilege of working at Atari was recognition enough, even if the general gaming community didn't know who ultimately worked on what titles. As an aside, and by the way, this kind of situation is exactly why early gaming Easter eggs mostly involved game developers coding hidden rooms in their games that simply displayed their name. They couldn't get recognition from the company they worked at, so they figured they were going to put their signature, so to speak, somewhere in the game itself. Anyway, despite the renegade nature of some early game developers giving themselves credit for the games they, in fact, created, that understandably was not enough for many developers at Atari, and it didn't take long before Crane, along with several other employees at the company, many of whom were some of Atari's earliest and best game designers, decided to do something about it. Which is why, in 1979, a small contingent of developers, including Crane, Alan Miller, Bob Whitehead, and Larry Kaplan, all left Atari to form a new company, and in the process, created the first third-party publisher to ever exist in the video game industry. That company, which still exists today, is none other than Activision. As a founding member of Activision and the company's senior game designer, Crane had additional latitude to design the games he wanted to create, and here, his overall philosophy around game design helped to direct his future efforts. Crane was always a believer in trying and doing things that others had never tried before, and in the context of video game development, that meant that he wanted to create titles and use features of video game consoles that others had never exploited, or attempted to exploit before. While Crane would work on several games over Activision's early years, most of which were solid but not necessarily blockbuster experiences, one general concept kept occupying his time, and that was how to create a humanoid player character that could be realistically animated on Atari 2600 hardware, which, given the capabilities of the console, would be quite the feat of engineering and design. Nowadays, the concept of creating a realistically animated human in a video game is something we all take for granted, as modern engines and game development tools make the act of implementing human characters and related animations an exceedingly simple process, with many engines even including pre-built routines and asset shops that can effectively automate that whole process in seconds. Making a human character appear to be, human on the Atari 2600 though? That was a different matter entirely. We've talked briefly in the past about the Atari 2600, and how many of the games released for that console had to take some creative liberties with how they represented characters in games, primarily driven by the fact that the Atari 2600 did not have a ton of graphics horsepower available to process and render high-quality sprites. In fact, a lot of Atari 2600 titles were designed to use simple geometric shapes and figures as stand-ins for real characters, simply because the system was good at drawing those shapes, and performance could be optimized as a result. Take, for example, the hit Atari title Adventure, released in 1980 and intended to be a graphical version of the text-based grandfather of all adventure games, Will Crowther's Colossal Cave Adventure. In Adventure, players are tasked with exploring a world consisting of 30 different screens, each of which may be populated by various enemies to defeat, traps to avoid, and treasures to recover. And your character, the proverbial knight in shining armor? He, my friends, was a square. And note, I don't mean that as a reflection of the player character's personality. I mean that your player character in Adventure was, in fact, a geometric shape. There were no arms, there were no legs, there was no head. All of those features had to be drawn in by a player's imagination. And don't get me started on how items were carried in the game, where those, once again, simple geometric shapes would appear as disembodied floating objects next to the nondescript squareness of your player character. Adventure may have had an expansive world for an Atari 2600 game, but the level of detail, or lack thereof, is something that I think most modern gamers would bounce off of really hard. Now, that's not to suggest that Adventure was a bad game, or that it wasn't a technological marvel that it even existed in the first place. No, quite the contrary. The fact that Adventure was able to do what it did on Atari hardware was nothing short of mind-blowing. As a prime example of why that is, let's take a look at the storage allotted by a typical Atari cartridge of the time, which for Adventure amounted to just 4 kilobytes of available storage. To put that into perspective, 1 second of audio from this podcast takes up approximately 20 kilobytes of data. That means in every second of audio that you're listening to, you can fit 5 copies of Adventure. That's crazy to me, and it's even crazier that a full game, albeit a primitive one, was able to be stored on just 4 kilobytes of memory. And just for awareness, Adventure's creator, Warren Robinett, ended up using nearly every bit of storage that was available to him, with only 15 bytes left over as quote-unquote available storage. Oh, and for all those Easter egg hunters out there, Adventure is somewhat famous for being one of the first known examples of an Easter egg being hidden in a video game, which in the case of Adventure was simply Robinett including a screen in the game that said, "Created by Warren Robinett." And that singular screen, by the way, took up 5% of the available storage space on the cartridge. Once again, the kinds of restrictions that developers had to work around with Atari hardware was truly crazy. Anyway, mild tangent aside, Atari 2600 games were super limited, and the level of graphical realism, especially as it relates to character graphics, was virtually non-existent. And David Crane, for his part, didn't think that was good enough. Like I mentioned, he always wanted to push the envelope of what was possible, to attempt to deliver an experience that was unexpected and, in some cases, unbelievable. So he spent a good chunk of time over several years developing an advanced, for the time, graphics technique for displaying and animating character graphics, eventually creating a humanoid character that actually looked and moved like a real person. There was just one problem. He had created a revolutionary graphical algorithm and figured out how to make it work with Atari hardware, which by itself was a feat of genius. But he didn't have an actual game concept to go along with that algorithm. He had toyed around with various ideas, like a cops and robbers kind of game, but he never really found a game concept that he thought would make sense with the technology he was trying to implement. He knew that if he could figure out a cool idea to pair with his human character graphics process, that he'd likely have a hit on his hands. He was just coming up a bit short on the idea front. That would all change in 1981 though, which saw the release of the Steven Spielberg-George Lucas collaboration, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones film. For anyone who may not be familiar with that film, first of all, shame on you, but secondly, Raiders of the Lost Ark tells the story of swashbuckling archaeologist Indiana Jones, who is very much not like traditional archaeologists, who some people believe are all funny little men searching for their mummies. And as an aside, a free point to anyone who gets that reference. Anyway, Indiana Jones is much more rugged, dashing, and adventurous than most college professors, and armed with a whip, and a gun, and a fair arsenal of left and right punches, he takes on a team of Nazis who are all attempting to recover the sacred religious artifact, the Ark of the Covenant. Whether Indiana Jones succeeds in stopping the Nazi menace or not, I'm not going to say. But regardless of how that story plays out, the main takeaway is that Indiana Jones is essentially the quintessential swashbuckling treasure-seeking adventurer. Well, it turns out that after David Crane saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, he came up with a new idea for a game that he thought would be the perfect application of his new human character design and advanced running animation. What if he could create an adventure title set in the jungle, where you controlled a man who would need to run, jump, and avoid obstacles and enemies, all in the pursuit of hidden treasures, a sort of less violent, though similarly adventurous Indiana Jones. Crane believed that his idea had real merit, and for the first time in years, he truly believed that he had a path forward to deliver something totally unexpected to Atari gamers around the world. With that concept in mind, Crane set out to begin creating his new game, the title that would eventually be released as the much-beloved classic Pitfall. Now, if all Crane did was create a small subset of screens for his new human character sprite to run around in, avoiding some obstacles along the way, he'd have likely had a hit on his hands, simply because of how impressive those character graphics and animations were. But doing the bare minimum wasn't really Crane's style. No, Crane didn't just want to use a cool graphics trick and call it a day. He wanted to create a truly expansive adventure experience, and he wanted to create a world that would dwarf the size of every other Atari game in existence. To do that, though, he'd have to pull out some very innovative programming techniques. Recall our discussion on how the 30-screen Atari title Adventure barely fit on a 4KB Atari cartridge. And further recall that Adventure, for the time, was considered to have a fairly expansive game world in comparison to its peers, many of which featured single game screens that oftentimes didn't change appreciably. Well, Crane's upcoming Pitfall title was envisioned as having a couple hundred screens for players to progress through, complete with a variety of creatures and enemies to avoid, obstacles to jump over, vines to swing on, crocodile heads to hop onto, and treasures to find and collect. The expanse of the game world on paper sounded like it would be impossible to create for an Atari 2600. The concept was simply too big to ever fit in 4KB of storage. David Crane, however, was not your typical software engineer, and he would end up using a programming technique that today is fairly commonplace, but back in 1982 was almost unheard of. The majority of games created in the late 70s and early 80s utilized hard-coded environments to form the backdrop of their game worlds, with unchanging layouts that had to be stored explicitly in whatever storage was available to them. This, as you might imagine, took up a fair amount of space, and in the case of Adventure, the 30 screens that the game utilized took up a huge portion of the 4KB cartridge that it shipped on. There was another option though, and one that Crane thought could get around the whole 4KB Atari cartridge limitation to allow him to create a world with 255 discrete screens, an unfathomable number in the Atari 2600 days. What if, rather than hard-coding that set of 255 screens, Crane could devise an algorithm that effectively generates each screen on the fly, based on some seed value that would consistently reproduce the same exact screen every time a player played the game. If he could figure out a way to utilize this kind of procedural, though still deterministic generation, then he could dramatically reduce the amount of storage required by the in-game environments, and could instead focus on adding additional game features, creatures, and treasures. So, Crane devised a method that would use a counter composed of 8 bits, with each bit representing a binary value of 0 or 1. He then used each of those bit combinations, which incidentally equals 255, or the number of rooms in the game, to represent a different configuration of obstacles, creatures, and gameplay elements that would be included on the corresponding screen related to that 8-bit combination. In this way, he could have 255 distinct screens while taking up next to no storage at all, which is such an ingenious approach to world design and generation that it honestly boggles my mind that Crane was able to come up with it in 1982. You know how 30 screens in Adventure took up nearly 4KB of data? Well, 255 screens in Pitfall took up only 50 bytes of information. That is 5% of a single kilobyte, for a world dramatically larger than nearly any game that had come before it. That, quite frankly, is insane. Now, to be fair, each screen did have some elements that were mostly common between them, like the background and foreground imagery, but regardless, in practice, Pitfall was being designed to be one of the biggest games on the Atari 2600. Interestingly, while most of Pitfall's design came directly from David Crane's brain, there were some changes that were introduced only through other people playtesting the game, which, as we've discussed in prior episodes, is a critical part of releasing a quality game to the masses. During playtesting, Crane was encouraged to tweak the jumping mechanics included in the game, the number of lives available to players, and the way that crocodile head leaps functioned, all of which, as originally implemented, were deemed to make the game almost impossible to play. Crane made these changes and in the process ended up with a game that he believed was much more engaging and fun to play, a testament to just how important getting feedback from other people can be. Eventually, Crane put the finishing touches on the game's design, the human character sprite and animations, and the various changes that playtesters suggested he make to the title, and Pitfall was finally ready to release on the market. The only question was, would gamers of the time appreciate the effort and genius that went into creating a game that in many ways featured concepts and capabilities that had truly never been seen before? The short answer to that question is yes, they would, as upon its release in September of 1982, Pitfall would garner significant critical praise, with many publications declaring the game to be one of the best adventure titles available for the Atari 2600. And even beyond that large but still limited console ecosystem, other critics would begin to sing Pitfall's praises as one of the best games of all time, which admittedly was not nearly as impressive in 1982 given the size of the video game market. But regardless, when you consider that sentiment still remains in 2025, you begin to see just how brilliant and beloved Crane's creation really was. Pitfall was equally successful from a commercial perspective, as the Atari version and its various ports to other contemporary gaming platforms like the Intellivision, Commodore 64, Atari 5200, and ColecoVision would end up selling over 5 million copies in the years following its release, an incredibly impressive number for a game from 1982, while also remaining the top-selling game on the Billboard Top Video Games chart for 64 weeks straight. Once again, a seriously impressive achievement. And in the years that would follow, Pitfall would also spawn a number of sequels and spin-off titles across a variety of computer and console platforms, with 9 distinct Pitfall games making up the main series of titles. Though of those, Crane only personally worked on Pitfall and Pitfall 2, with the other titles in the series either being outsourced to other development companies or occurring after Crane left Activision in 1986, a move that would see him work with a variety of companies en route to his next big game release, A Boy and His Blob: Trouble on Blobolonia in 1989. That, however, is a story for another day, and if anyone is interested in hearing my thoughts on that title, be sure to check out episode 89, where we talk exclusively about A Boy and His Blob. To say Pitfall was a big deal would be an understatement, and with Pitfall's release, David Crane firmly established himself as one of the top game designers and developers in the industry, while also introducing the world to a game that, in the eyes of many, was one of the best games they had ever experienced. I'll relay my personal opinion on the title in just a couple minutes, but suffice it to say, regardless of what you may think of Pitfall, or if you think it might be too old to sufficiently enjoy today, there is no denying that what David Crane was able to accomplish from a technical perspective was truly amazing. And for Atari 2600 owners of the time, the end result was an experience that, for many, will remain a personal favorite then, now, and forever. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Pitfall today versus when it was released over 40 years ago. Pitfall, at its core, is a platforming title, albeit one without platforms, and your goal as you play the game is to run, jump, and swing your way across various obstacles, all in the pursuit of treasure. From a conceptual perspective, and even from a game design standpoint, Pitfall might be one of the simplest games we've ever covered for this podcast, as that description pretty much encapsulates all there is to do in the game. You run, you jump, you swing, and that's pretty much it. And given the fact that Pitfall is a title from the early days of the video game industry, the design of the title doesn't really have a lot of secrets to uncover or hidden mechanics to find. What you see is what you get with Pitfall, and hearing that, you may be thinking to yourself that Pitfall would perhaps be too simple to be worth your time. Only here, you would be wrong, as in this simplicity lies a truly incredible game, which from my perspective is perhaps one of the few titles that I can say approaches video game design and gameplay perfection. That might sound like hyperbole, so it's probably a good idea to explain why I feel the way I do. To start though, let's go over the overall framework for a round of Pitfall. When you start the game, you're given 3 lives, including the one you start with, and 20 minutes. And your goal is to survive as long as possible while acquiring as many points as possible, which you can increase by finding treasures hidden throughout the game world. When you first start playing the game, you'll begin by pressing either left or right, which will make your character begin sprinting in the direction of your choosing, and then it's off to the races. Your timer begins counting down, and you now have to find as much treasure as possible within that time limit. The first thing you'll notice is that the controls here are exceedingly simple, in that you basically only need to press left or right and jump, and that's almost the extent of the controls in the game, other than having to press down in order to leap off of a vine if you happen to be swinging on one. Otherwise, that's it. Those are the game's controls. The crux of the game's gameplay comes down to using those simple controls to navigate the game's various environments, and here there is a surprising amount of diversity built into the game. Each screen you encounter, of which there are 255, can be designed with any number of different obstacles that, when combined together, create a mini platforming puzzle box that you need to figure out as quickly as possible. Some of those obstacles, like stationary snakes and campfires, represent deadly obstacles that simply need to be leapt over, while other obstacles, like moving and stationary barrels, serve to both slow down your progress as well as deplete some of your score, as if you come into contact with a barrel, your score will begin to decrement. What this means is that in order to maximize your score at the end of your playthrough, you need to not only avoid deadly obstacles like snakes, but also non-deadly obstacles like rolling barrels. While score isn't really important other than for bragging rights, the bigger issue is that colliding with barrels will slow you down, which is important if you're trying to beat the game. And yes, despite what we all thought for decades, and despite the game's manual actually saying that you can collect every treasure, there is a way to actually beat Pitfall. More on that in a little bit. Anyway, you'll also encounter a number of different pits in the game, and for the purposes of our discussion at the moment, I'm talking about the pits that appear in the center of a given screen, not the ones that lead down to the bottom half of the screen, which we'll talk about later. So, for those pits that do in fact kill you, you'll notice that they come in two varieties. One type of pit is stationary and simply encompasses the entire center part of the screen, which you'll need to use a vine to swing over. Vines, by the way, appear in a bunch of different screens, and serve as a means of swinging over otherwise insurmountable obstacles, as well as giving you an optional way of traversing certain obstacles that can, technically, be surmounted by other means, like appropriately timed running and jumping. The second type of pit is one that expands and contracts from the center of the screen, which can throw you off a bit if you didn't realize that this feature existed in the game, because on screens with expanding and contracting pits, a lot of times you'll enter an area and see an entirely flat piece of land and think, oh cool, an easy screen, only to get sucked up by a bottomless pit of despair that randomly appears under your feet. In general, if you enter a screen and the ground seems completely uneventful and without any obstacles, you can almost guarantee there's some form of expanding pit in the middle of it, just waiting to gobble you up. If you don't see the pit when you first enter one of those screens, your best bet is to wait a second or two for the pit to appear, and then time your run with the pit contracting so that you can actually make it to the other side of the screen. Now, while these pits are all colored in black, representing a descent into the earth, there's actually a second type of pit, so to speak, which is effectively a pool of water. Just like the basic pits, pools of water may be stationary, or they may be the expand and contract variety, and mechanically, they function the same exact way as pits do. The only difference, literally, is that they're colored blue instead of black. I honestly don't think that's an issue at all, as I can appreciate wanting to add some diversity to the game's environment and color palette, which the pool pits certainly did. There's another type of pool though, which is one infested by 3 crocodiles that could potentially ruin your day if you don't time your traversal correctly. As you might expect, those 3 crocodiles open and shut their mouths every couple seconds, so getting across these pools requires waiting for the crocodiles to close their mouths, and then jumping 3 times in rapid succession to get over the water and to the other side of this particular obstacle. Interestingly, while the main way to get over these crocodiles is to jump on their heads when their mouths are closed, you can technically step on their eyes even if their mouths are open, a fact you can exploit to reduce the amount of time needed to get through certain screens. I will say this is a bit tricky to pull off, as the solid section of the crocodile's head when its mouth is open is pretty narrow, and if you miss the jump, you'll end up falling into the water and losing a life. You absolutely can get the spacing down, but it requires a bit of practice, and even then, it might be better to play it safe as opposed to opening yourself up to an unfortunate death. As far as obstacles go, at least on the top half of each screen, that's pretty much it, with the diversity of each screen driven by how those various obstacles are combined. As an example, you might walk into one screen that has a pool of crocodiles in the center with a vine swinging over them, allowing you the option of either jumping across the crocodile heads or jumping onto the vine and swinging across the pool of water and crocodiles in one smooth motion. The next screen might present you with a few rolling barrels, a snake on the side, and an expanding pit in the center of the screen, where you'll need to time your run to avoid the pit and time your jumps to leap over the stationary snake, and any rolling barrels that happen to be coming your way. The next screen after that might be one with a pit in the center, a swinging vine overhead, and a stationary barrel on the far side of the pit, where you have to swing across the pit, land, and then run and jump over that stationary barrel. I'm not going to belabor the point because by now you probably get the idea. Suffice it to say, even though there are only a handful of true obstacles in the game, because each screen combines those obstacles in different ways, the majority of the screens feel fairly unique and dynamic. That being said, there are definitely some screens that are effectively repeats of each other, which is almost unavoidable given the limited power of Pitfall's target system, the Atari 2600. Still, it's a testament to the game's design that the game feels as diverse as it does, despite the limitations of the technology of the time. Now, I've mentioned a couple times before that we've been talking about the quote-unquote top half of the screen, and if you've never played the game, you might be wondering what, if anything, is found on the bottom half of the screen. Well, it turns out that the bottom half of each screen is effectively a set of caverns inhabited by the trickiest enemy in the game, which I think is a scorpion. The way it works is, as you're playing the game and running around on the top half of the screen, you may come across a ladder leading into the caverns below the screen, or perhaps a gap in the land that you may drop down into, thereby leading you to the caverns. These gaps, by the way, are distinguishable from the deadly pits in that they are purely rectangular, and I believe they only occur on screens that also contain a ladder, which is a way of realizing that a fall there doesn't kill you, it simply takes away some of your points, and if you're trying to stay on the top half of the screen, slows you down. Anyway, once you get to the bottom half of the screen and begin running around, you'll find the one and only enemy that inhabits those caverns, the dreaded scorpion. This is an incredibly deadly enemy, though at first glance, they appear pretty darn straightforward, in that all you have to do is leap over them to progress on your adventure. The issue is, the scorpions are not stationary. They move, slowly, towards your general direction, and you need to time your run and your jump to avoid these moving and deadly obstacles. It won't take long to get the hang of avoiding these guys, but even after a few hours playing the game, you'll probably make a mistake and die to a scorpion or two every now and then. The timing for your jump is fairly tight, and the hitbox for the scorpion is pretty large, so this is one of those obstacles that even after you get proficient with the game's mechanics, remains deadly and worthy of your focused attention. Other than the obstacles we just spoke about, the only other items in the game are the various treasures, 32 in total, that are hidden throughout the game world, and it is your job to find as many of those treasures as possible within the 20 minutes you're given for your playthrough. You might think that that would be a fairly straightforward task, only here you would be wrong, as the 32 treasures are hidden in such a way that finding all of them in a single 20-minute playthrough is next to impossible, and for years it was assumed that there was literally no way to find all 32 treasures in one run through the game. The issue is, the game has 255 total screens, and given the speed of your movement and the size of each screen, it is literally impossible to see every single screen in a single playthrough, which means simply running left and right perpetually, even if you maximize your time and traverse each obstacle perfectly, will not allow you to collect every treasure in the game. So you might be wondering, how can the game actually be beaten? Well, the answer to that lies in the underground caverns we've been talking about, and the unique way that movement is handled in those sections versus the above-ground sections of the game. By default, if you're running around on the top half of the screen, meaning the above-ground section, you'll move a single screen if you move left or right off the side of the current screen. Assuming that the game's map is simply a sequence of 255 screens laid next to each other, moving left or right while you're above ground simply moves you to the next screen in that sequence, meaning if you were to try to see the entire game, you would have to traverse 255 screens total, which, like I mentioned, cannot be accomplished in the 20-minute time limit the game gives you. Interestingly, it turns out that traveling below ground is a sort of shortcut, where every time you move to the left or right of the screen while traveling below ground, you end up moving the equivalent of 3 spaces above ground. This turns out to be the only way you'll be able to cover enough screens to actually collect all 32 treasures in the game before you run out of time. And even then, you need to play pretty much perfectly in order to actually beat the game. I've actually spent a fair amount of time researching the optimal path through the game, as well as looking at some speedruns for the title, simply to understand how feasible collecting all treasures in 20 minutes is. To that end, I've gathered some details to share, coupled with my own experience playing the game for enough hours to become proficient enough to get through the game in 20 minutes. First, let's look at the most optimized route through the game, as executed using a tool-assisted speedrun, which for those who might not know, is effectively the end result of someone programming in a series of predefined inputs for a given game, on a frame-by-frame basis, and stitching those inputs together into the equivalent of a script that can be executed using a computerized bot. These tool-assisted speedruns often represent a perfect run through a game, because you literally have individuals programming in the exact inputs needed at every single possible point in the game in order to achieve the best possible outcome for any given situation. So bottom line, tool-assisted speedruns represent the best possible time a game can be completed in, assuming that the speedrun has been optimized. For Pitfall, a tool-assisted speedrun completes the game with 1 minute and 55 seconds left on the clock, meaning a perfect run through the game with a perfect score of 114,000 points takes 18 minutes and 5 seconds. That means, for a normal human player, there is effectively less than 2 minutes of slack in any given playthrough between perfection and defeat. The world record speedrun for a human completing the game with a perfect score is 18 minutes and 18 seconds, or 1 minute and 42 seconds left on the clock. That's a 13-second difference between the perfect tool-assisted speedrun and the best human speedrun in the world. Now for my run. After hours of practicing, learning the best route through the game, getting good enough to avoid obstacles wherever possible, I finally beat the game with 16 seconds to spare. And that was most certainly not a perfect score, as I definitely came into contact with several barrels along the way, and fell down into a couple holes as opposed to climbing down the ladders present throughout the game. This tells me a few things. For one, the game is beatable with some practice, and as we'll talk about, the overall design of the game, the controls, the patterns to memorize, everything comes together to create an experience that is entirely learnable, infinitely replayable, and insanely enjoyable from beginning to end. But it is also a fairly challenging title, though it always feels 100% fair, and it rewards practice and perseverance as opposed to luck. My second observation is the degree of difference between absolute perfection and simply beating the game is pretty slim, which means that the game's winning condition was designed to be incredibly difficult to achieve in 1982 when the game was first released. Back then, there was no internet available to look up an optimal path through the game, so any progress players would make was dependent solely on their ability to map out the game world, one screen at a time, and then figure out when to use underground passages to skip screens and find treasures. This would have taken an extensive amount of time by truly dedicated players, so it's not hard to see why many people believed the game was unbeatable, even though the manual references a perfect score as an achievable outcome. My third and final observation is that even though the game was technically beatable, Activision didn't really expect many players to reach that feat, which is why in the game's manual, there's a section that talks about the Pitfall Harry Explorer Club, which you can join if you manage to acquire 20,000 points in a single playthrough, which is a far cry from the 114,000 points that you'd need to earn for a perfect run. That suggests to me that a score of 20,000 points is considered pretty darn good, and is likely an achievable goal for players to reach for. Anyway, regardless of how many points you earn, or how far you get in the game, or if you use a guide to find every treasure while you hone your skills to a sharp edge, the fact is Pitfall, despite being a very simple, straightforward design, is an example of the kind of game that you can spend hours upon hours playing, having fun every moment without ever feeling significant frustration. The game is designed so well that it legitimately shocked me, as I wasn't expecting such greatness from an Atari 2600 title from 1982. This is one instance where my expectations were greatly exceeded, and I was pleasantly surprised that was the case. We're going to talk more about the more specific aspects of the game in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have the ability to go to YouTube and watch gameplay videos of games we might be interested in. No, back then, if we wanted advice or suggestions about a game, we either got them via word of mouth from family and friends, magazine review articles, or we made that decision based on what the box looked like in the game store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Pitfall for the Atari 2600, the back of the box says, Activision presents Pitfall, Pitfall Harry's Jungle Adventure. Conceived and designed by David Crane for one fearless fortune hunter at a time. Let me introduce myself. I'm Pitfall Harry, veteran jungle explorer. Fortune hunting's my game, and yours too if you're daring enough to take this trip with me. Don't be nervous. I'll be your guide through the jungle, and I'm one of the best. Untold riches are waiting for us in there, but so are dangers a dozen times over. We'll be swinging on vines over bottomless tar pits. We'll be hopping across swamps using crocodile heads like stepping stones. We'll be searching underground through dark passageways, crawling with killer scorpions. So pack up your backpack and meet me at the jungle at dawn. And we'll be off to seek a king's ransom in gold, diamonds, and lost treasures. In Pitfall Harry's Jungle Adventure. And that's pretty much it. There is no screenshot. There's nothing like that. This is a very traditional Atari 2600 box with a little description on the back. And I've got to say, this actually kind of sells me on the game. Now, I know what the Atari 2600 is capable of. So I know that showing a bunch of screenshots on the back of the box wouldn't necessarily do the game justice because graphics, honestly, not really the strong suit of the Atari 2600. But listening to the way the game was described and the action and adventure of traversing all of these jungle screens, just from an imagination perspective, I'm kind of intrigued. And to be honest, if I were in the market for Atari 2600 games back when this came out, now I was a little bit young at this point, but if we had an Atari 2600 and I had seen this on the game store shelves and I knew how to read, I probably would have picked this up. Regardless, the box actually does sell me, and I think it's actually a pretty good representation of what the game is, even today. We're going to move on now to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game itself, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Pitfall are incredibly simple, with only a handful of colors on the screen at any point in time, most of them being a shade of green, and each character and object model being a simple pixel art representation of that character or object. If you take one look at the game, you will quickly know that you're seeing an older title, and in no way do these graphics hold up to modern titles. That being said, it doesn't even matter, because the quality of the graphics on display here is so much better than what you'd see in many Atari 2600 games that Pitfall deserves special recognition as a truly good-looking title. Think about a game like Adventure, where your character is literally a square, and you're navigating angular geometric mazes representing the game world. Adventure has been widely considered as a game that really pushes the Atari 2600 hardware, a fact that really draws attention to the fact that the Atari 2600 was not all that powerful to begin with. Pitfall, by contrast, feels like a retro interpretation of a real-world environment and characters, with irregularly shaped trees and foliage, a number of different characters that look the way you'd expect them to, as opposed to being represented by geometric shapes, and a huge overall game world that most games couldn't hope to match, even in later years. Of particular note is your character, Pitfall Harry, who not only isn't a geometric shape, but rather looks incredibly lifelike, or at least as lifelike as a collection of 10-ish pixels can look. The most impressive visual feat, though, is the animation prevalent throughout the game, by far, as the smoothness of the visuals coupled with movement that feels real is something that just wasn't a thing in 1982. In fact, Harry's movement is so smooth that it almost felt like it was rotoscoped, similar to games like Karateka and Prince of Persia. Now, Harry's animations aren't quite as smooth as Prince of Persia, but they're really not all that far off, which, considering these animations were running on an Atari 2600, is akin to technical wizardry. Seriously, incredibly impressive visuals for an Atari 2600 title, and because of how closely the game mimics real-world settings and situations, your imagination can very clearly fill in any gaps that may exist, which makes the whole experience feel even more awesome than it otherwise would have. A truly impressive visual experience. Moving on to the sound and music, there's not a whole lot to talk about related to sound and music because the only music that plays throughout the game are very, very brief jingles when certain things happen, like swinging on a vine to cross a gap in the ground, or dying to an enemy. If you're looking for a deep auditory experience, you're not going to get that here. But honestly, that's okay, as I never felt like the lack of audio impeded my enjoyment of the game. The gameplay here is so stellar that it masks the lack of music entirely, and even though I typically complain about such a sparse audio environment, in this case, I'm actually okay with it. For awareness, any of the music you're hearing in this episode actually comes from various versions of Pitfall 2, which did in fact have some background music. I know that means this episode isn't 100% accurate as it relates to Pitfall on the Atari 2600, but it was legitimately the only way we'd be able to get any audio included in this episode, short of hearing my own voice. So, hey, you take what you can get. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Pitfall Harry, explorer extraordinaire, and you have just arrived in the jungle with a mission. You are to seek out as much treasure as possible in the hopes of continuing to bolster your status as a world-renowned treasure hunter. You'll have to avoid numerous obstacles and creatures on your path to fame and fortune, but if you're successful, you will undoubtedly be the talk of the town. Fail, and you might become the latest in a long line of adventurers lost to the jungle forever. As you might expect given the age of the game, there really isn't any story to speak of, both in the game itself as well as in the game's manual, other than the barest of narratives talking about seeking out treasure. Though in this instance, that actually works out to be okay, as the premise of the game is very simple. You are to seek out treasure and stay alive, which is pretty much the main goal and driving force for each of your playthroughs. In this way, Pitfall is more akin to arcade games of the time, where your primary goal was getting a high score as opposed to experiencing a deep narrative, which is totally fine. My only caution here is to know what you're getting into before you start playing the game. There is no real story, so just focus on the quality of the gameplay rather than trying to figure out a narrative reason for doing what you're doing. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked about the overall structure of the game, as well as the game's control scheme, so I'm not going to rehash any of that here. What I do want to touch upon, though, is the overall playability of the title, which is an incredibly important aspect of a game whose sole purpose is to deliver a meaningful gameplay experience. To put it plainly, Pitfall is about as close to a perfect, simple platforming title as has ever been created. Every aspect of the game's design is distilled down to the most basic of concepts, and even someone who has never played Pitfall before will immediately be able to tell what to do, and most likely how to do it, given the simplicity of the game's controls. In modern times, we've come to expect super deep gameplay and narrative experiences, with tons of different button combinations to help us execute myriad different attacks, maneuvers, and abilities, and this complexity is sometimes even considered a benefit as individuals explore which current gaming title to devote their time to. Pitfall is not that. Instead, it is the art of gaming at its most basic, the true essence of gaming, and it is, quite simply, perfection. There is not a single aspect of the game that is unfair or designed poorly, with every jump, movement, and timing-based obstacle to overcome feeling expertly crafted, with the controls being so tight that I often didn't even realize I was controlling a game, instead slipping into a flow-like state where I simply became one with the experience. I know that sounds corny, but it's absolutely true. Pitfall is one of those rare titles that will encase you in a cocoon of immersion, not because the world is so lifelike, or the graphics are so advanced, or the music is so beautiful, or even that the narrative is so profound. No, Pitfall has none of that. What it has, though, is gameplay that is nearly unmatched, and just like all of the best titles from the golden age of arcades, the gameplay here is enough to keep you playing for hours without ever feeling like it's a chore. It's simply a fun game, one that anyone can pick up and play, though not without its own challenges to overcome. It is, in a word, phenomenal. So, what is our verdict on Pitfall? Well, it's probably not a surprise, but Pitfall is undoubtedly deserving of a spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. And considering how early of a release it was, and how influential it would end up becoming, I could see the argument for Pitfall being placed on the Mount Rushmore of video game releases. It is that good, and I honestly did not expect such a strong response when I sat down to play the game. I figured it would be good, but I also assumed that it would feel old, an aging relic of a time long past, and a game that, while important, likely didn't really hold up today. Well, I was proven wrong on all counts, as Pitfall is, even today, one of the best games of all time. And if you consider yourself a gamer, and especially if you've never played the game before, you owe it to yourself to give it a go. Pitfall is a rare gem of an experience, and as such has just become our newest inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Pitfall. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Ground Zero, Texas. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. So if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Ground Zero, Texas. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.